Beyond the shimmering mirage of a sun-baked continent, beyond the familiar narratives of European settlement, lies a story etched in time, a saga spanning epochs. This is the Chronicle of Australia, a land of paradox and profound beauty, a place where ancient whispers echo through modern cities, where the oldest living culture on Earth harmonizes with a vibrant, multicultural present. For millennia, this vast island continent was a world unto itself, a magnificent natural laboratory fostering unique life, cradling secrets beneath its ochre plains and emerald rainforests. Its shores, once thought mythical, guarded an extraordinary human history, a journey of resilience, adaptation, and an unbreakable connection to country that stretches back into the mists of time. Far beyond recorded history, this is not merely a tale of discovery, but of profound transformation. It's the story of how an isolated land became a global player, how diverse peoples forged a nation, and how the ancient spirit of a timeless continent continues to shape its destiny. Prepare to journey through the very fabric of time, from the deep past to the dynamic present, to uncover the true, epic story of Australia. The deep past, Gondwana and the first peoples to truly grasp Australia's story. We must first journey back, not just centuries, but hundreds of millions of years. Imagine a supercontinent, a colossal landmass known as Gondwana, a colossal puzzle piece encompassing what we now know as Antarctica, South America, Africa, India, and of course, Australia. This was Earth's deep past, a primordial canvas upon which the very foundations of this unique continent were laid. For eons, Australia was intricately woven into this immense geological tapestry, its ancient rocks bearing witness to the dramatic ballet of continental drift. Around 180 million years ago, the Great Fracturing began, a slow, inexorable separation driven by the colossal forces beneath the Earth's crust. As the pieces drifted apart, Australia embarked on its solitary voyage, an independent journey that would profoundly shape its ecological destiny. This long isolation, spanning tens of millions of years, became Australia's defining characteristic. Cut off from the evolutionary pressures and migrations of other landmasses, its flora and fauna began to evolve down a unique path. Here, in this vast, secluded laboratory of life, marsupials thrived and diversified, becoming the dominant mammalian forms. Giant wombats, formidable diprotodons, and towering kangaroos roamed plains unlike any other. The ancient lineage of eucalypts and acacias adapted to the continent's increasingly arid conditions, painting the landscape with their iconic hues and distinctive forms. This deep time, this immense geological and biological evolution forms the silent, powerful prologue to the human story. Then, into this ancient, pristine world, stepped humanity. The precise timing of the first human arrivals in Australia remains a subject of ongoing scientific inquiry, but archaeological evidence now points to an astonishingly deep antiquity. It is believed that the ancestors of today's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples arrived on the continent around 65,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. This wasn't a casual stroll, but an epic journey, a testament to incredible seafaring capabilities and navigational prowess. During periods of lower sea levels, land bridges and shorter sea crossings connected Southeast Asia to the landmass of Sal, which encompassed present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. These intrepid voyagers, driven by a spirit of exploration and survival, navigated challenging waters, making landfall on the northern shores. From these initial points of arrival, they fanned out across the vast continent, adapting to an extraordinary array of environments, from the scorching deserts of the interior to the lush rainforests of the north. From the rugged mountains of the southeast to the temperate coasts, they not only survived, but thrived, developing an unparalleled understanding of the land and its resources. Over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations, each with its own language, customs, laws, and spiritual beliefs, emerged. They lived in complex, interconnected societies, governed by intricate kinship systems and ancient lore. The ingenuity and wisdom of Australia's First peoples were profound. They were master ecologists, practicing sophisticated land management techniques like mosaic burning, which prevented catastrophic wildfires, encouraged new growth, and promoted biodiversity. Their knowledge of native plants and animals was encyclopedic, allowing them to sustainably harvest food, medicine, and materials from the land. This wasn't simply survival, it was a profound partnership with country. Their spiritual beliefs were inextricably linked to the land, their ancestors, and the dreaming, a complex framework encompassing creation, law, morality, and the very essence of existence. Every rock formation, every water hole, every tree held a story, a song, a sacred meaning. Their artistic traditions, particularly rock art, stand as enduring testaments to their creative genius and deep spiritual connection. Sites like the incredible galleries of Kakadu and the ancient shelters of the Kimberley hold artworks dating back tens of thousands of years. Some of the oldest continuous artistic traditions on Earth. These weren't mere decorations, they were visual narratives, teaching tools, ceremonial expressions, and historical records, the intricate patterns, the vivid depictions of ancestral beings, animals, and human activities offer an unparalleled window into their rich spiritual and cultural lives. The arrival of humans also coincided with, and potentially contributed to, the extinction of Australia's megafauna. While climate change undoubtedly played a role, some theories suggest that the hunting practices of early humans, coupled with landscape changes brought about by fire management, may have accelerated the demise of these magnificent giants. This remains a topic of active debate and scientific investigation, highlighting the complex interplay between human presence and environmental impact, even in the deep past. For countless generations, these first peoples were the sole custodians of this vast continent. Their societies flourished, adapting and evolving through periods of climatic change, maintaining a profound and sustainable relationship with their environment. Their legacy is not merely one of survival, but of a sophisticated, enduring culture that developed in isolation for tens of thousands of years, creating a vibrant tapestry of languages, traditions, and an unbroken connection to country that stretches back further than almost any other continuous human culture on the planet. This extraordinary prologue sets the stage for the dramatic transformations that were to come, as the ancient isolation of Australia was irrevocably shattered by the arrival of a new, distant world. European encounters and the dawn of colonization. For millennia, Australia remained a distant, mysterious continent to the outside world, while ancient trade routes skirted its northern fringes, and there is evidence of limited contact with Macassan traders from Indonesia. The vast southern landmass remained largely uncharted by European powers. The idea of a great terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land, persisted in the imaginations of cartographers and explorers for centuries. It was a theoretical balancing weight to the landmasses of the northern hemisphere, a speculative continent whispered about in maritime taverns and scholarly circles. The age of exploration, fueled by technological advancements in shipbuilding and navigation, coupled with a relentless pursuit of new trade routes, resources, and strategic advantage, would inevitably bring European ships to these distant shores. The Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish were the early pioneers, pushing the boundaries of the known world. While some scholars debate potential earlier Portuguese sightings, it was the Dutch who made the first undisputed European landing. In 1606, Willem Janszoon, aboard the Dijfken, sighted the coast of Cape York Peninsula, marking the first documented European contact with the continent. He charted about 320 kilometers of the coastline, mistakenly believing it to be a continuation of New Guinea. His encounters with the local Aboriginal people were hostile, leading him to describe the land as barren and its inhabitants as savage. This initial, fleeting interaction set a negative precedent, shaping early European perceptions. Over the next century and a half, numerous Dutch navigators, including Dirk Hartog, Abel Tasman, and Willem de Vlaming, explored parts of Australia's northern and western coastlines. They meticulously mapped vast stretches of the New Holland coast, documenting its stark beauty and, often, its perceived lack of valuable resources. Abel Tasman, in particular, was a monumental figure, charting large sections of the southern coast and discovering the island he named Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, in 1642. Yet, despite these extensive explorations, the Dutch saw little economic incentive to establish permanent settlements. The land seemed too remote, too dry, and its indigenous inhabitants too resistant. Their focus remained on the rich spice trade of the East Indies. New Holland remained largely an outpost, on the periphery of their vast maritime empire, a place to chart and then largely forget. It would be another great maritime power, Great Britain, that would ultimately claim this distant land. The catalyst arrived in the form of Captain James Cook, a prodigious navigator and cartographer, in 1770. Under secret instructions to search for the elusive southern continent, Cook sailed his ship, HMS Endeavour, south from New Zealand. On April 29th, he sighted the fertile eastern coast of Australia, a dramatic contrast to the barren western shores the Dutch had encountered. He anchored in a beautiful bay, which his botanist Joseph Banks, marveling at the abundance of unique flora, named Botany Bay. Cook's meticulously detailed charting of the entire eastern coastline, which he named New South Wales, was groundbreaking. He claimed the entire eastern half of the continent for Britain, based on the legal fiction of terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This assertion fundamentally disregarded the tens of thousands of years of continuous occupation by Aboriginal peoples, and it would have profound and devastating consequences for them. Cook's expedition was not a true discovery, as the land was already inhabited, but it was a pivotal moment in European expansion, shifting Australia from an unknown land to a potential prize for the burgeoning British Empire. His positive reports on the land's fertility and resources, though sometimes exaggerated, opened the door for future colonization. The impetus for British colonization was not initially grand strategic design or the lure of exotic spices. Instead, it emerged from a very pressing social problem at home, an overcrowded penal system. Following the loss of the American colonies, Britain could no longer transport its convicts across the Atlantic. Its prisons and hulks were overflowing, leading to social unrest and disease. The solution proposed by influential figures like Joseph Banks, who had sailed with Cook, was the establishment of a penal colony in New South Wales. It was a radical idea. Use a distant, largely unknown land as a dumping ground for convicts, a place from which escape would be virtually impossible. Thus, the First Fleet, a flotilla of 11 ships carrying around 1,500 people, approximately 780 convicts, along with Marines, officers, and their families, set sail from Portsmouth, England, in May 1787, led by Captain Arthur Phillip, a pragmatic and humane officer. This epic voyage took over 8 months, navigating the vast, often treacherous oceans. It was an incredible feat of seamanship and logistical planning, the largest single transoceanic migration in history up to that point. On January 18, 1788, the First Fleet arrived in Botany Bay, only to find the site unsuitable due to lack of fresh water and poor anchorage. Philip quickly moved the fleet a few kilometers north to Port Jackson, a magnificent natural harbor. On January 26, 1788, a date now commemorated as Australia Day, though a day of mourning for many Indigenous Australians, the British flag was raised, and formal possession was taken of the land. Sydney Cove, with its deep water and fresh stream, became the site of the first permanent European settlement in Australia. The early years of the colony were brutal. The land was far from the fertile paradise Cook had sometimes described. The soil was poor, the climate harsh, and the settlers lacked the agricultural knowledge suited to the Australian environment. Food shortages were constant, and the colonists faced immense challenges in establishing a self-sufficient settlement. Discipline was severe, and the convicts, many of whom were petty criminals or victims of the harsh social conditions in Britain, endured immense suffering. But amidst the hardship, a new society began to coalesce, built on the foundations of a penal system, but slowly evolving into something more complex. This arrival, this raising of the flag, marked an irreversible turning point for the Aboriginal peoples. It was the catastrophic disruption of tens of thousands of years of continuous existence. Their land, their way of life, and their very survival were now under threat from a foreign power whose intentions they could not fathom and whose diseases they had no immunity against. The stage was set for a clash of cultures, a struggle for land and identity that would define the next centuries of Australian history. The long isolation of the continent was over, replaced by the unstoppable tide of European expansion. Convicts, conflict, and consolidation. The landing of the First Fleet marked the beginning of a profound and often tragic clash of cultures. The British, operating under the assumption of terra nullius, saw an empty land ripe for settlement, a place to build a new society from scratch. For the Aboriginal peoples, however, this was their ancestral home, meticulously managed and deeply cherished for millennia. Their initial encounters with the newcomers ranged from wary curiosity to outright hostility. The Eora people of the Sydney region, witnessing the sudden arrival of thousands of strangers, their strange ships and even stranger customs, quickly understood the scale of the invasion. The consequences for the indigenous population were devastating. The European diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, to which Aboriginal people had no immunity, swept through communities with horrifying speed and lethality. Within a few years of the First Fleet's arrival, the population of the Sydney Basin was decimated. An invisible, biological warfare more destructive than any musket. This catastrophic loss of life profoundly weakened the ability of indigenous nations to resist the encroaching tide of settlement. Their numbers, their social structures, and their spiritual ties to specific lands were fractured by the unseen enemy. As the colony of New South Wales slowly expanded beyond the confines of Sydney Cove, so did the conflict. This was the era of the frontier wars, a series of localized but pervasive and often brutal conflicts that raged across the continent. For over a century, as European pastoralists and settlers pushed deeper into Aboriginal lands, these were not conventional wars with formal declarations and set-piece battles, but rather a protracted, violent struggle for resources and territory. Aboriginal resistance, though fragmented and often poorly armed against the superior firepower of the British, was fierce and persistent. They employed guerrilla tactics, using their intimate knowledge of the landscape to launch ambushes, raid livestock, and disrupt settler movements. The British response was often swift and merciless, driven by a desire to protect property, secure new grazing lands, and enforce colonial authority. Retaliatory massacres of Aboriginal people were disturbingly common, often carried out by armed settler parties, sometimes with the tacit or overt approval of colonial authorities. Places like Mile Creek, where in 1838, 11 unarmed Aboriginal people were murdered by stockmen, and, crucially, 7 of the perpetrators were later hanged, a rare instance of justice, stand as grim reminders of the violence that underpinned the expansion of the colony. But for every Mile Creek, countless other atrocities went unrecorded or unpunished. The dispossession of land was not a peaceful process. It was achieved through force, disease, and the systematic dismantling of indigenous social and economic systems. Meanwhile, the convict system continued to be the lifeblood of the fledgling colony. Convicts, ranging from petty thieves to political rebels, formed the bulk of the early workforce. They built roads, cleared land, constructed buildings, and toiled on government farms. Their labor was brutal, often under the lash of overseers and the threat of further punishment, such as transportation to harsher penal settlements like Norfolk Island or Port Arthur and Van Diemen's Land, loomed large. These remote outposts were designed for maximum deterrence, places of unimaginable suffering and solitary confinement, intended to break the spirit of even the most hardened criminals. Yet, Even within this harsh system, elements of a new society began to emerge. Convicts, upon receiving a ticket of leave or completing their sentences, could become emancipist free settlers. They could acquire land, establish businesses, and contribute to the colony's growth. This unique social dynamic, where former prisoners could rise to positions of influence, created a society unlike any other in the British Empire. It fostered a degree of social mobility, albeit a difficult one, and contributed to a nascent sense of Australian identity that was distinct from the rigid class structures of Britain. The currency lads and lasses, those born in the colony, grew up with a different perspective, less bound by the old world's hierarchies. As the penal system slowly gave way to a more economically driven settlement, new industries began to take root. Early ventures included whaling and sealing, exploiting the abundant marine life around the Australian coast. But it was wool that would become the colony's first great economic success. The introduction of merino sheep, particularly by figures like John MacArthur, laid the foundation for a thriving pastoral industry. The vast, open grasslands of New South Wales proved ideal for sheep grazing, and Australian wool soon gained a reputation for its quality. And the booming textile mills of industrial Britain, this wool boom fueled further expansion, driving settlers deeper into the interior, inevitably leading to more clashes over land and water with indigenous communities. The pursuit of new grazing lands and resources necessitated further exploration. Brave and often foolhardy explorers, like Hume and Hovell, Sturt, Mitchell, and Leichhardt, ventured into the uncharted interior, enduring incredible hardships in their quest to map the continent, find and land seas a persistent European fantasy, and locate arable land. Their expeditions, while often tragic in their human cost, slowly unveiled the vastness and diversity of the Australian landscape, challenging initial perceptions of a uniformly arid interior. The administration of the colony, initially a military governorship, gradually evolved. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who served from 1810 to 1821, is often credited as the father of Australia for his vision in transforming New South Wales from a mere penal settlement into a functional society. He encouraged social reform, oversaw the construction of public buildings, roads, and bridges, and promoted the rights of emancipists, much to the chagrin of the exclusives, free settlers, and military officers who looked down upon former convicts. Macquarie's progressive policies laid much of the groundwork for the future development of the colony, pushing for a more orderly and prosperous society. Though his policies also had a profound impact on Indigenous people, as his drive for expansion exacerbated frontier conflicts. By the mid-19th century, the colonies were beginning to take shape beyond New South Wales. Van Diemen's Land, initially a brutal penal outpost, grew into a separate colony. Free settlement began to flourish in what would become Victoria and South Australia, driven by agricultural potential and land grants rather than solely convict labor. Western Australia also saw early, though challenging, free settlement. These nascent colonies, though still firmly under British control, were developing their own distinct characters and economic interests. The era of consolidation was one of stark contrasts: incredible hardship for convicts, devastating loss for Aboriginal peoples, and immense opportunity for those free settlers willing to brave the challenges. It was a period defined by the assertion of British power, the relentless push of settlement, and the gradual, often brutal, forging of a new colonial society on an ancient continent. The seeds of distinct Australian identities were being sown, but the full flowering of these identities and the true test of the young colonies was yet to come. The next great wave of change, more sudden and transformative than any before, was about to break across the land. The Golden Age and colonial transformation, just as the young colonies were slowly, painstakingly establishing their economic footing. A seismic event occurred that would irrevocably alter their trajectory, accelerate their growth, and fundamentally reshape their social fabric. The discovery of gold, while minor finds have been Reported earlier, it was the substantial discovery of alluvial gold in Ophir, New South Wales. In February 1851, followed swiftly by even richer finds near Ballarat and Bendigo in Victoria. That ignited a feverish global phenomenon. The news spread like wildfire, sparking one of the largest and most rapid mass migrations in human history. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers, known as diggers, flocked to Australia from all corners of the globe, from Britain, Ireland, Europe, America, and, significantly, from China. The population of Victoria, in particular, exploded, growing from around 77,000 in 1850 to over 500,000 by 1860. Melbourne, once a small pastoral town, rapidly transformed into a bustling, wealthy metropolis. Its ornate architecture a testament to the immense riches flowing from the goldfields. Sydney, too, experienced significant growth. Though not on the same scale as its southern rival, life on the goldfields was a chaotic blend of harsh labor, desperate hope, and rough justice. Diggers endured arduous conditions, battling the elements, disease, and the constant physical strain of digging, panning, and cradling for gold. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. While some struck it rich, the vast majority found only enough to get by, or nothing at all. Yet, the allure of instant wealth was irresistible, creating a unique and often boisterous society on the diggings. Stores, pubs, and informal governance sprang up, creating vibrant, if often lawless, communities. The gold rushes profoundly impacted the social landscape. They were a powerful democratizing force, challenging the old-class hierarchies of the penal era. On the goldfields, a former convict could strike it richer than a free settler, and a working-class immigrant could achieve wealth beyond their wildest dreams. This sense of opportunity, combined with the shared hardship and independent spirit of the diggers, fostered a more egalitarian ethos that would become a defining characteristic of Australian identity. The goldfields were also a crucible of political change. The diggers, many of whom were educated and politically aware immigrants, chafed under what they perceived as arbitrary rule, oppressive license fees, and a lack of democratic representation. This discontent culminated in the Eureka Stockade in Ballarat in December 1854. Frustrated by heavy-handed government policies and police corruption, a group of diggers, led by Peter Lalor, swore an oath to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. They erected a stockade and raised a distinctive Southern Cross flag. The colonial authorities responded with force, storming the stockade in a brief but bloody engagement. While the diggers were defeated militarily, and casualties were sustained on both sides, Eureka proved to be a watershed moment in Australian history. The public outcry over the treatment of the diggers led to significant reforms. The hated gold license was replaced by a minorist right, and diggers gained the right to vote. Eureka, though a rebellion, became a powerful symbol of Australian democracy, individual rights, and resistance against unjust authority. It solidified a nascent sense of national identity based on fairness and a suspicion of centralized power. Beyond the immediate impact of gold, the rushes provided an unprecedented injection of capital and labor that propelled the colonies into a new era of development. The massive increase in population created a demand for goods and services, stimulating secondary industries. Infrastructure development boomed, roads were improved, bridges were built, and, most significantly, a railway network began to spread across the colonies, connecting inland goldfields and agricultural regions to the major ports. This infrastructure was vital for transporting goods and people, knitting the disparate settlements together. The immense wealth generated by gold also funded the construction of impressive public buildings, parliament houses, universities, art galleries, and grand Victorian architecture, transforming the rough and ready colonial towns into sophisticated, self-confident cities. Melbourne, in particular, became known as Marvellous Melbourne, a thriving metropolis with a vibrant cultural scene. often rivaling major European cities in its grandeur and ambition. The influx of new people also brought new ideas and a diverse range of social and political perspectives. While the initial wave of immigration was predominantly British and Irish, the Gulf fields also attracted significant numbers of Chinese, Americans, Germans, and Italians, among others. This growing multiculturalism, though often met with prejudice and discriminatory policies, particularly against the Chinese, began to add new layers to the evolving Australian identity. The economic and social transformations of the Gold Rush era fueled a growing desire for greater self-governance. With a rapidly expanding population and robust economies, the colonies chafed under the direct rule of London, the British government, increasingly preoccupied with its vast global empire, was receptive to the idea of granting greater autonomy. By the mid-1850s, the major colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Van Diemen's Land, renamed Tasmania in 1856, were granted responsible government, allowing them to elect their own parliaments and control their own domestic affairs, though still remaining part of the British Empire. Queensland separated from New South Wales in 1859, and Western Australia followed suit much later. This period saw the rise of distinct colonial identities, each with its own unique characteristics, economic drivers, and political interests. Victoria, rich from gold, became a progressive, industrial powerhouse. New South Wales, with its long history and established pastoral wealth, remained a powerful, more traditional force. South Australia, founded on principles of free settlement and religious freedom, developed a reputation for social reform, though still separate entities, sharing a common British heritage. The seeds of a larger, unified Australian nation were slowly beginning to germinate beneath the surface of colonial rivalry. The challenge of connecting these disparate colonies and forging a single national identity would be the defining task of the next era. Federation and the birth of a nation, the latter half of the 19th century, saw the Australian colonies flourish, each developing its own identity, economy, and political system. Yet, despite their individual successes, the idea of a unified Australia began to gain momentum. The vast distances between the colonial capitals, once a barrier, were slowly being overcome by advancements in communication and transport. Telegraph lines spanned the continent, allowing near-instantaneous messages, and steamships and emerging railway networks began to connect the major population centers, fostering a greater sense of shared experience. Several compelling factors drove the push for federation. Economically, intercolonial tariffs were a constant source of friction, impeding trade and hindering growth. A unified national market would remove these artificial barriers, fostering greater prosperity. Defense was another critical concern. While individually the colonies possessed small, disparate military forces, the growing geopolitical tensions in the Pacific, particularly the rise of Germany and Japan, highlighted the vulnerability of a divided continent. A single, national defense force was clearly a more effective deterrent, perhaps even more powerful than economic or defense considerations. Was the burgeoning sense of a distinct Australian identity. No longer simply transplanted Britons, the currency lads and lasses and the waves of immigrants who had adopted Australia as home were beginning to see themselves as Australians. They shared common experiences, the unique landscape, the bush ethos, a growing sporting culture, and a burgeoning body of Australian literature and art. The independent spirit forged on the gold fields and the shared struggle against the harsh environment fostered a sense of camaraderie and a desire for self-determination that transcended colonial boundaries. The journey to federation, however, was far from straightforward. It was a complex, drawn-out process marked by intense debate, colonial rivalries, and moments of both grand vision and petty squabbling. Early attempts at intercolonial cooperation, such as the Federal Council of Australasia, established in 1885, proved largely ineffective, lacking executive power and not including all colonies. The movement needed strong leadership and a popular groundswell of support. Sir Henry Parkes, the charismatic Premier of New South Wales, often called the Father of Federation, delivered his famous Tenterfield oration in 1889, calling for a convention to draft a federal constitution. This speech is widely regarded as the spark that truly ignited the Federation movement. Over the next decade, a series of constitutional conventions were held, bringing together leading politicians and legal minds from across the colonies. These conventions meticulously debated every aspect of the proposed new nation, its parliamentary structure, the division of powers between the federal government and the states, and the rights of its citizens. The draft constitution drew heavily on British parliamentary traditions, the American federal system, and Canadian constitutional principles, but it was also shaped by unique Australian circumstances and aspiration. Key features included a bicameral parliament, a House of Representatives, and a Senate, an independent judiciary, and a commitment to the rule of law. A fundamental tenet of the proposed federation was that the states would retain significant powers, reflecting the strong colonial identities and a reluctance to surrender too much autonomy to a central government. Despite the intellectual rigor of the conventions, the path to nationhood was still fraught with political obstacles. The proposed constitution had to be put to the people in a series of referendums, and gaining sufficient support in all colonies proved challenging. Issues such as the location of the federal capital, fears of smaller states being dominated by larger ones, and concerns over economic implications caused significant debate and even initial rejections in some colonies. It took persistence, compromise, and a genuine belief in the national ideal to overcome these hurdles. Finally, after years of tireless campaigning by Federalists, the people of the colonies voted yes. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act was passed by the British Parliament in July 1900, and Queen Victoria assented to it. On January 1, 1901, at a grand ceremony in Centennial Park, Sydney, the Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed. The 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, became the founding states of a new, independent nation. United under a federal constitution, Edmund Barton, a leading Federalist, became Australia's first Prime Minister. The birth of the Commonwealth marked a monumental achievement. It was a peaceful and democratic act of nation-building, a testament to the ability of disparate colonial entities to come together for a common purpose. The new nation inherited a vast continent, a strong British heritage, and a nascent sense of its own unique identity. However, this new nation was also founded on a complex legacy, one that largely excluded its indigenous peoples from the foundational promises of citizenship and self-determination. The initial constitution, for example, excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the national census and effectively denied them the right to vote in federal elections, a significant omission that would take decades to rectify. The optimism of nationhood, while powerful, also masked underlying social tensions and the challenge of forging a truly inclusive society. The White Australia policy, a cornerstone of early federal legislation, reflected a prevailing fear of non-European immigration and a desire to maintain racial homogeneity. This policy, designed to restrict non-white immigration, would have long-lasting and often damaging effects on Australia's international relations and its internal social fabric. The new nation, while unified in its governance, still had a long way to go in defining its full identity on the world stage and ensuring justice for all its inhabitants. The wars and the Roaring Twenties, the ink was barely dry on the new Commonwealth Constitution when the fledgling nation faced its first major test on the global stage, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Despite being over 16,000 kilometers from the battlefields of Europe, Australia, as a loyal dominion of the British Empire, immediately pledged its support. The call to arms resonated deeply with the young nation's desire to prove its worth and demonstrate its commitment to the mother country. Tens of thousands of young men, eager for adventure and driven by a strong sense of duty, volunteered to fight. What followed was an experience that would forge a powerful and enduring national legend. The ANZAC Australian and New Zealand Army Corps legend. Australian troops were dispatched to the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, a disastrous Allied campaign that aimed to secure a sea route to Russia. The landing on April 25, 1915, was met with fierce Turkish resistance, and the ensuing 8-month campaign became a brutal stalemate. The Anzacs endured horrific conditions, heavy casualties, and immense hardship, though ultimately a military failure. Gallipoli became etched into the Australian psyche as the crucible of national identity. The characteristics displayed at Gallipoli, courage, mateship, resourcefulness, and a willingness to challenge authority, became enshrined as core Australian values. The Anzac spirit symbolized a new kind of soldier, one who, despite being green, fought with exceptional bravery and resilience. After the withdrawal from Gallipoli, Australian forces were redeployed to the Western Front in France and Belgium, where they fought in some of the most brutal and attritional battles of the war. Fromelles, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux. The scale of the carnage was immense, with Australian casualties reaching staggering levels. Out of a population of fewer than 5 million, over 416,000 Australians enlisted, and more than 60,000 were killed, with another 156,000 wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner. The war had a profound and lasting impact on Australian society. On the home front, women took on new roles in factories and agriculture, contributing significantly to the war effort. Conscription debates bitterly divided the nation, highlighting deep social and political fissures. The immense human cost of the war left an indelible mark on almost every family, fostering a sense of collective sacrifice and a poignant understanding of the horrors of modern warfare. It also fostered a growing sense of independent nationhood, as Australia had contributed significantly to the Allied victory, carving out its own reputation on the global stage. After the armistice in 1918, Australia, like much of the world, entered a period of recovery and significant social change. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, brought an era of economic optimism, social liberalization, and technological advancement. Soldiers returned home, often to a world that had changed profoundly, and faced the challenge of readjustment. The economy rebounded as Australia continued to rely heavily on its primary industries, wool, wheat, and minerals, but also saw the beginnings of secondary manufacturing. Culturally, the 1920s were a vibrant time. The cities bustled with new energy, jazz music, flapper fashion, and new forms of entertainment like cinema and radio captured the public imagination. The increasing availability of motor cars began to transform transportation and leisure. Women, having played a crucial role during the war, continued to push for greater social and political equality. The sense of national identity, forged in the fires of war, deepened, manifesting in a growing confidence in Australian arts, sports, and a distinct way of life. Politically, the young Commonwealth continued to mature. The choice of a national capital proved to be a contentious issue, a symbol of the lingering rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and Canberra, a purpose-built federal territory, was selected. The opening of Parliament House in Canberra in 1927 marked another significant milestone, establishing a permanent home for the nation's democratic institutions. The development of Canberra, designed as a garden city, reflected the aspiration of a young nation building its future. However, beneath the surface of prosperity and progress, unresolved issues simmered. The White Australia policy remained firmly in place, shaping immigration and reinforcing a racially homogenous national identity. The plight of Indigenous Australians, largely ignored in the national narrative of progress, continued to be one of dispossession, marginalization, and discriminatory policies. The legacy of the frontier wars, combined with the devastating effects of disease and forced assimilation policies, meant that Aboriginal communities faced immense challenges. Their voices were still largely unheard, and their rights largely unrecognized by the new nation. As the 1920s drew to a close, the world economic situation began to deteriorate. The prosperity built on a wave of post-war optimism and speculative investment was fragile. Australia, heavily reliant on export markets and foreign loans, was particularly vulnerable to global economic downturns. The buoyant mood of the Roaring '20s was about to give way to an unprecedented period of hardship, testing the resilience of the young nation once again. The Great Depression loomed, a stark reminder that even a nation forged in the fires of war and economic growth was not immune to the wider forces shaping the 20th century. The Great Depression and the road toward the carefree spirit of the Roaring '20s abruptly shattered with the Wall Street crash of October 1929. The ripple effects of this global economic catastrophe quickly reached Australia, a nation heavily reliant on its export markets and vulnerable to fluctuations in international trade and finance. The Great Depression, as it became known, plunged Australia into an unprecedented period of hardship, fundamentally reshaping its society and politics. The collapse of commodity prices for wool and wheat, Australia's primary exports, devastated the rural economy. Farm incomes plummeted, leading to widespread foreclosures and rural unemployment. Cities, too, bore the brunt of the crisis. Factories closed, construction projects halted, and unemployment soared to staggering levels, reaching over 30% in 1932, one of the highest rates in the developed world. For those without work, life became a desperate struggle for survival. Families lost their homes, sustenance. Payments became a lifeline for many. A makeshift shanty towns, grimly nicknamed shanty towns or happy valleys, sprang up on the outskirts of major cities, housing the newly impoverished. The human cost of the Depression was immense. Malnutrition, disease, and the breakdown of family structures became common. The psychological impact of prolonged unemployment and the erosion of dignity left deep scars on a generation. People relied on community support, charity, and their own resilience to survive. Humor, often dark and self-deprecating, became a coping mechanism, as did the enduring Australian spirit of mateship and looking out for one another. The political landscape was thrown into turmoil. Governments at both federal and state levels grappled with how to respond to the crisis, often disagreeing fiercely on the best course of action. Debates raged between those advocating for austerity and fiscal responsibility, and those pushing for greater government spending and social welfare. Scowen's Labour government, which came to power just as the Depression hit, struggled to find effective solutions, facing immense pressure from within and without. The Premier's Plan of 1931, a harsh package of expenditure cuts and wage reductions, was deeply unpopular but seen by many as necessary to restore economic stability and reassure international lenders. The social unrest sparked by the Depression also led to widespread protests and demonstrations. Unemployed workers marched, demanding relief and jobs, and clashes with police were not uncommon. The crisis also exposed the deep ideological divisions within Australian society, particularly between the labour movement and conservative forces. Despite the immense hardship, Australia avoided the political extremism seen in some other countries during the same period, a testament to the strength of its democratic institutions and the resilience of its people. The Depression, though devastating, forced a re-evaluation of economic policy and the role of government. It highlighted the need for social safety nets and a more interventionist approach to managing the economy. It also reinforced a pragmatic, self-reliant streak in the national character, a determination to weather any storm. As the decade progressed, a slow, arduous recovery began, driven by an increase in wool prices and a gradual improvement in global trade. As Australia slowly emerged from the economic abyss, new and terrifying clouds gathered on the international horizon. The rise of fascism in Europe, particularly Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, and the aggressive militarism of Imperial Japan in Asia, began to cast a long shadow over global peace. The League of Nations, created after World War I to prevent future conflicts, proved increasingly ineffective in restraining these expansionist powers. For Australia, still deeply tied to Britain, the unfolding events in Europe were a grave concern. Prime Minister Joseph Lyons, and later Robert Menzies, grappled with the dilemma of preparing for war while still rebuilding the national economy. There was a growing awareness that while loyalty to the British Empire remained strong, Australia's strategic interests were increasingly tied to the Asia-Pacific region. The fall of Singapore to Japan in 1942, often seen as an impregnable fortress, would later dramatically underscore this reality and fundamentally shift Australia's strategic outlook. Despite the geographical distance, Australians understood that a new global conflict would inevitably draw them in. Memories of the immense sacrifice of World War I were still fresh, but the threat posed by aggressive totalitarian regimes was undeniable. The government began to rearm, expanding its small military forces and preparing for the unthinkable. The national mood shifted from economic despair to a growing sense of apprehension and a reluctant acceptance of the inevitability of war. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, following the invasion of Poland, Australia once again followed suit. Prime Minister Robert Menzies, in a somber radio broadcast, announced Australia's entry into the conflict, stating, "It is my melancholy duty to inform you, officially, that as from 9 o'clock this morning, Australia is at war with Germany." The decision, while widely supported, carried with it the heavy burden of past sacrifice and an uncertain future. The Great Depression had tested the nation's resolve, but the coming global conflict would prove to be an even greater trial, one that would force Australia to truly define its place in a rapidly changing world. World War II and a new global alignment. Australia's entry into World War II in September 1939 was initially driven by its strong imperial ties. Australian troops were once again dispatched to fight alongside British forces in the European and North African theaters, continuing the tradition forged in the trenches of the First World War. Elite units like the Rats of Tobruk earned renown for their tenacious defense against Rommel's Afrika Korps. However, the war's trajectory would soon take a dramatic and terrifying turn for Australia, bringing the conflict directly to its shores. The devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, followed swiftly by the fall of Singapore in February 1942, shattered any illusion of Australia's geographic isolation or the invincibility of British imperial power in the Pacific. The fall of Singapore, a supposedly impregnable fortress and cornerstone of British defense strategy in Asia, was a profound psychological blow. Thousands of Australian troops were captured, and the Japanese war machine, seemingly unstoppable, was now poised on Australia's doorstep for the first time in its European history. Australia faced the very real and existential threat of invasion. The threat became terrifyingly real on February 19, 1942, when Darwin, the northern Australian capital, suffered a devastating air raid by Japanese forces, killing hundreds and sinking ships. This was the first of many attacks on Australian soil, including bombing raids on other northern towns, attacks by Japanese midget submarines in Sydney Harbour, and even shellings of Newcastle. The Brisbane Line controversy, a rumor that a defence line would be drawn across northern Australia, abandoning the south to invasion, reflected the profound anxiety and fear gripping the nation, with its traditional protector, Britain, preoccupied with the war in Europe. Australia was forced to re-evaluate its strategic alliances. Prime Minister John Curtin made the momentous decision to turn to the United States for help, issuing his famous declaration, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." This marked a fundamental shift in Australia's foreign policy, laying the groundwork for a deep and enduring alliance with the United States that continues to this day. American forces poured into Australia, transforming cities like Brisbane into vital command centers. General Douglas MacArthur established his Southwest Pacific Area headquarters in Melbourne, coordinating the Allied counter-offensive against Japan. Australian and American troops fought side by side in brutal jungle campaigns in New Guinea and other Pacific islands, pushing back the Japanese advance inch by agonizing inch. The Kokoda Track Campaign in Papua New Guinea, where Australian diggers fought valiantly against overwhelming odds and horrific conditions, became a new symbol of Australian courage and resilience. On the home front, the entire nation mobilized for total war. Industries converted to wartime. Production, rationing was introduced, and propaganda campaigns urged national unity and sacrifice. Women played an unprecedented role, stepping into traditionally male jobs in factories, agriculture, and the armed services. The Australian Women's Army Service AWAS, Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force WAAF, and Women's Royal Australian Naval Service WRANS saw thousands of women serve, challenging traditional gender roles and contributing significantly to the war effort. The experience of shared threat and common purpose deepened a sense of national unity, cutting across class and social divides. When the war finally ended in 1945, Australia emerged victorious. What profoundly changed, the national consciousness had been irreversibly altered by the direct threat of invasion and the realization of its strategic vulnerability. The Anzac legend was reinforced, but now with a clear understanding of its unique position in the Asia-Pacific. The alliance with the United States had become a cornerstone of its defense policy, and the ties to Britain, while still important, were no longer the sole determinant of its global outlook. The immediate post-war period was dominated by a powerful imperative: populate or perish. The experience of the war had made it clear that Australia's vast, largely empty continent was vulnerable. To secure its future, the nation needed a significantly larger population. This led to one of the most ambitious and transformative immigration programs in Australia's history, marking a radical departure from the restrictive white Australia policy of the early Commonwealth. While British immigration remained a priority, the government actively sought migrants from war-torn Europe. Millions of new Australians arrived from countries like Italy, Greece, the Netherlands, Germany, and later from Eastern Europe, fleeing the aftermath of war and seeking new opportunities. This mass immigration program, managed by figures like Arthur Calwell, provided the labor force needed for post-war reconstruction and the booming economy. These new arrivals worked on major infrastructure projects like the Snowy Mountains Scheme, a vast hydroelectric and irrigation complex that symbolized Australia's ambition and engineering prowess. The influx of diverse cultures began, slowly but surely, to transform Australia from a predominantly Anglo-Celtic society into a more multicultural nation. While challenges of assimilation and prejudice certainly existed, the post-war immigration program laid the groundwork for the rich cultural diversity that defines modern Australia. The war had reshaped Australia's strategic landscape, while the immediate aftermath began to reshape its very demographic and social fabric, paving the way for an era of unprecedented prosperity and a redefinition of what it meant to be Australian. The world was now truly on its doorstep, and Australia was opening its own doors to the world. Post-war prosperity and shifting sands. The end of World War II ushered in an unprecedented era of economic prosperity for Australia, stretching through the 1950s and much of the 1960s. The global demand for raw materials, combined with a strong domestic manufacturing sector and a rapidly expanding population, fueled a sustained boom. Australia earned the moniker "the lucky country," a phrase coined by Donald Horne reflecting not just its abundant natural resources, but also the good fortune of avoiding the direct devastation of the two world wars that had ravaged Europe and Asia. This prosperity fundamentally reshaped Australian society. The dream of home ownership became a reality for millions, as vast new suburbs sprawled outwards from major cities. These suburban landscapes, characterized by detached houses with gardens, became the quintessential Australian ideal, fostering a strong sense of family and community life. Consumerism flourished, driven by rising disposable incomes and the increasing availability of new technologies. Televisions became commonplace, transforming leisure and communication. Refrigerators, washing machines, and cars became symbols of modern living. The post-war immigration program continued apace, bringing millions of new Australians from across Europe. These diverse arrivals contributed immensely to the economic boom, providing vital labor for factories, farms, and major infrastructure projects like the iconic Snowy Mountains scheme. While the White Australia policy still legally underpinned immigration until the 1960s, the practical implementation of the program gradually softened, allowing for a broader range of European migrants and subtly laying the groundwork for a truly multicultural future. In terms of foreign policy, Australia firmly aligned itself with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. The ANZ-US Treaty, signed with the United States and New Zealand in 1951, became the bedrock of Australia's defense strategy. This formal alliance, born out of the strategic anxieties of World War II and the perceived threat of communism in Asia, solidified Australia's shift away from its sole reliance on Britain and cemented its new position as a key regional partner to the United States. This strong anti-communist stance led Australia to participate in a series of Cold War conflicts. Australian troops fought in the Korean War 1950 to 1953 as part of a United Nations force, demonstrating their commitment to collective security. Later, and far more controversially, Australia became deeply embroiled in the Vietnam War 1962 to 1972, driven by the domino theory, the fear that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow. Successive Australian governments committed troops to support the U.S. effort. Vietnam proved to be a highly divisive conflict on the home front. National service conscription was reintroduced, leading to widespread protests, particularly among young people and university students. Anti-war movements gained significant momentum, challenging government policy and traditional notions of loyalty and duty. The experience of Vietnam, much like the conscription debates of World War I, highlighted a growing social and generational divide within Australia, and ultimately contributed to a questioning of unquestioning alignment with powerful allies. Beyond the geopolitical shifts, the 1960s were a period of profound social and cultural transformation within Australia. The youth counterculture, influenced by movements in the United States and Europe, began to challenge traditional values and norms. Pop music, fashion, and social freedoms gained prominence. The women's liberation movement gathered pace, advocating for equal pay, reproductive rights, and greater opportunities for women in education and the workplace. Figures like Germaine Greer, an influential Australian feminist, gained international prominence. Crucially, the 1960s also saw the nascent stirrings of a powerful Indigenous rights movement. For decades, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had suffered under discriminatory laws and policies, facing segregation, dispossession, and systemic racism. The 1960s brought a growing awareness, both domestically and internationally, of these injustices. The Freedom Ride in 1965, a bus tour through rural New South Wales, led by Indigenous activist Charles Perkins and university students, exposed entrenched racism and segregation in country towns, drawing national and international attention to the plight of Aboriginal people. This growing public awareness culminated in the landmark 1967 referendum, which proposed critical changes to the Australian Constitution. Firstly, it would allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be counted in the national census, finally recognizing their full humanity and citizenship. Secondly, it would give the federal government the power to make laws specifically for Aboriginal people, overcoming the previous state-based legislative patchwork, which often resulted in inconsistent and discriminatory policies. The referendum passed with an overwhelming yes vote, over 90%, making it the most successful referendum in Australia's history. It was a powerful symbolic moment, reflecting a widespread desire for justice and recognition, and it paved the way for future reforms in Indigenous affairs. By the end of the 1960s, Australia was a nation on the cusp of even greater change. The post-war economic boom was beginning to slow, social values were shifting rapidly, and the global political landscape was becoming increasingly complex. The confident, somewhat insular lucky country of the immediate post-war decades was about to enter a new era of introspection, reform, and a deeper engagement with its own identity and its place in a rapidly evolving world. Social revolution and economic rebirth. The 1970s ushered in a period of profound social and political reform in Australia, spearheaded by the election of the Whitlam Labor government in December 1972. Gough Whitlam, a charismatic and visionary leader, came to power promising to reorder the priorities of the nation and bring about a more progressive, modern Australia. His government embarked on an ambitious program of reform, challenging long-held traditions and pushing the country towards a more independent and socially just future. Key among Whitlam's reforms was the dismantling of the remnants of the White Australia policy. While previous governments had begun to liberalize immigration, Whitlam's government officially and unequivocally ended the racially discriminatory policies, ushering in an era of true multiculturalism. This policy shift fundamentally changed the face of Australia, welcoming immigrants from Asia, the Middle East, and other non-European regions, transforming Australia into one of the world's most ethnically diverse nations. New institutions like the Australian Institute of Multicultural Affairs were established to support this burgeoning diversity. The Whitlam government also introduced universal healthcare, Medibank, the precursor to Medicare, free university education, and significant reforms in family law and social welfare. It recognized China, withdrawing recognition from Taiwan, and ended conscription, bringing home the last Australian troops from Vietnam. It was a whirlwind of change, aimed at creating a more egalitarian and outward-looking nation. Crucially, the Whitlam era saw a renewed focus on Indigenous rights, and a deeply symbolic moment. Whitlam famously poured sand into the hand of Vincent Lingiari, an Aboriginal elder, at Wave Hill in 1975, returning ancestral lands that had been forcibly taken. This act, though symbolic, prefigured the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976, which, under the subsequent Fraser government, granted Aboriginal people in the NT the right to claim title to traditional lands. While controversial, these were crucial steps towards addressing the historical injustices faced by Australia as First Peoples and acknowledging their unique status as the original custodians of the land. However, the transformative ambitions of the Whitlam government were challenged by the global economic downturn of the 1970s, triggered by the oil crisis. Australia, like many Western nations, experienced stagflation, a toxic combination of high inflation and high unemployment. The government's ambitious spending programs, coupled with rising global prices, led to economic instability and growing public discontent. This economic turmoil, combined with political controversies and a hostile Senate, culminated in one of the most dramatic events in Australian political history, the dismissal of November 11th, 1975. In an unprecedented move, the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, dismissed the elected Whitlam government, citing its inability to secure supply funding through the Senate. This constitutional crisis sparked widespread outrage and a passionate debate about Australia's democracy, the role of the Governor-General, and its ties to the British Crown. Though constitutionally legal, the dismissal remains a deeply contentious event, highlighting the inherent tensions in Australia's Westminster system. Following a brief period of conservative government under Malcolm Fraser, the Labour Party returned to power in 1983 under the charismatic leadership of Bob Hawke, followed by Paul Keating. The Hawke-Keating years 1983 to 1996 saw another wave of significant reforms, this time with a strong focus on economic modernization and integration into the global economy. Landmark policies included floating the Australian dollar, deregulating the financial sector, and significant reforms to the industrial relations system. These changes, often painful in the short term, laid the groundwork for decades of sustained economic growth and transformed Australia into a more competitive and resilient economy. Under Hawke and Keating, Australia also intensified its engagement with Asia. Recognizing the profound importance of its geographic region, trade ties strengthened, diplomatic relations deepened, and there was a conscious effort to move beyond a purely European-centric view of the world. This era saw Australia play a more active role in regional forums like APEC, and push for greater economic integration with its Asian neighbors. The 1980s and 90s also witnessed further advancements in Indigenous rights, culminating in the landmark Mabo decision of the High Court in 1992. This historic ruling overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius, acknowledging that native title existed at the time of European settlement and had not been extinguished. Where continuous connection to land could be proven, Mabo paved the way for the Native Title Act, 1993, which provided a legal framework for Indigenous land claims and recognition of their traditional ownership. This was a monumental step towards reconciliation and a more honest reckoning with Australia's colonial past. By the end of the 20th century, Australia was a nation transformed, economically strong, socially diverse, and increasingly confident on the world stage. It had shed many of its old colonial assumptions. The push for a republic, though not yet realized, gained significant momentum, reflecting a growing desire for full independence from its monarchical past. The millennium loomed, promising a new chapter for a nation that had come a very long way from its penal origins, yet still carried the complex legacies of its history into the future. The new millennium and modern challenges as the clock ticked past midnight on December 31st, 1999. Australia, like the rest of the world, embraced a new millennium with a sense of boundless optimism. The new century began with a spectacular affirmation of national confidence and identity. The Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, hailed as one of the most successful Olympics ever, the Games showcased Australia to the world, demonstrating its efficiency, its warmth, its vibrant multiculturalism, and its deep connection to its Indigenous heritage. The stunning opening ceremony, featuring Indigenous performers and symbolism, was a powerful statement of Australia's unique place in the world and its evolving understanding of its own history. The spirit of the Olympics, particularly the focus on reconciliation, carried forward into the early 21st century. The Stolen Generations Report, Bringing Them Home, published in 1997, had revealed the shocking history of Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families under past government policies. For years, there have been calls for a formal apology from the Australian Parliament. Finally, on February 13, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a powerful and heartfelt national apology to the stolen generations, acknowledging the pain and suffering caused by these policies. This was a profoundly significant moment, a step towards healing and reconciliation. Though the journey towards true equality and justice for Indigenous Australians remains ongoing, the 21st century quickly brought a new set of profound challenges to Australia, particularly those posed by climate change. As a continent already prone to extreme weather, Australia found itself on the front lines of global warming. The Millennium Drought, one of the worst in recorded history, gripped much of the country for over a decade, devastating agriculture and putting immense strain on water supplies. This was followed by catastrophic bushfire seasons, most notably the Black Saturday fires of 2009 in Victoria, and the unprecedented Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020, which scorched vast areas, destroyed thousands of homes, and had a devastating impact on wildlife and ecosystems. Alongside the fires and droughts, Australia also experienced record-breaking floods, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales, causing widespread destruction and displacement. These recurring and intensifying natural disasters brought the reality of climate change home to millions of Australians, sparking intense debates about climate policy, renewable energy, and the nation's reliance on fossil fuels. The Great Barrier Reef, a global icon, faced increasing threats from coral bleaching events, further highlighting the fragility of Australia's natural environment. Despite the environmental challenges, Australia's economy demonstrated remarkable resilience. While the global financial crisis (GFC) of 2008-2009 devastated many economies around the world, Australia managed to weather the storm without entering a technical recession. This was largely attributed to a strong banking sector, proactive government stimulus packages, and, crucially, continued demand for Australia's vast mineral resources from rapidly industrializing nations, particularly China. The resources boom of the 2000s and early 2010s saw immense wealth flow into the country, transforming the mining sector and boosting national income, although it also contributed to a two-speed economy and debates about income distribution. This economic strength further cemented Australia's reorientation towards Asia. While traditional ties with the UK and US remained vital, trade and diplomatic relations with countries like China, Japan, South Korea, India, and the nations of Southeast Asia deepened significantly. Australia became an increasingly active player in regional economic forums and security dialogues, recognizing its future was inextricably linked to the prosperity and stability of the Indo-Pacific. Socially, Australia continued its evolution into a truly multicultural society. Immigration from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa diversified the nation's demographics, languages, and cultural landscape. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne became global hubs, renowned for their vibrant culinary scenes, arts, and diverse communities. This diversity, while generally celebrated, also brought challenges related to social cohesion, integration, and occasional flare-ups of racial tension. Political life in the 21st century has been characterized by a period of relative instability, with frequent changes in leadership within both major parties. Debates on social issues intensified, including marriage equality, which was finally legislated in 2017 after a national postal survey. The question of Australia becoming a republic, replacing the British monarch as head of state, remained a persistent, if sometimes dormant, discussion, reflecting a nation still navigating its post-colonial identity. Similarly, calls for Indigenous constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament continued to gain momentum, reflecting a growing national desire to formally acknowledge and empower the First Peoples of Australia. Within its founding document, the first decades of the new millennium demonstrated Australia's adaptability and strength in the face of complex global and domestic challenges. From celebrating its place on the world stage to confronting its environmental vulnerabilities and grappling with its historical legacies, Australia continued to mature as a nation, building on its foundations while charting a course for an uncertain but hopeful future. The story of this ancient land and its modern inhabitants was far from over. Indeed, it was entering a dynamic and pivotal new chapter. Contemporary Australia and future horizons today. Australia stands as a vibrant, prosperous, and proudly independent nation. Its transformation from a remote penal colony to a leading liberal democracy with a strong economy and a unique multicultural identity is a testament to its resilience, adaptability, and the enduring spirit of its people. With a population of over 26 million, it is a nation that has embraced its geographical reality in the Indo-Pacific, balancing its strong Western alliances with ever-deepening engagement with its Asian neighbors. Technological advancement has become a driving force in modern Australia, from its burgeoning tech startup scene to its world-class research institutions. Australia contributes significantly to global innovation in areas ranging from medicine and renewable energy to agriculture and advanced manufacturing. Digital connectivity has reshaped communication, commerce, and daily life, ensuring that even vast distances can be overcome in this digital age. Australian cities are consistently ranked among the most livable in the world, renowned for their quality of life, cultural vibrancy, and economic opportunities. On the global stage, Australia plays an active and influential role. It is a committed advocate for the rules-based international order, engaging in multilateral diplomacy through organizations like the United Nations, the G20, and the Commonwealth. It contributes to global security through its defense forces, participating in peacekeeping missions and international alliances. As a significant aid donor, Australia supports development and stability in the Pacific Island nations and Southeast Asia, recognizing its responsibility as a regional leader. Its voice is increasingly heard on issues of global importance, from climate action and human rights to trade liberalization and regional security. However, contemporary Australia also faces significant challenges. Addressing the ongoing disadvantage and achieving true self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples remains a critical national priority. The Voice to Parliament proposal, aiming to enshrine an Indigenous advisory body in the Constitution, represents a crucial step in this journey, sparking a national conversation about reconciliation and structural reform, closing the gap in health, education, and economic outcomes for Indigenous Australians is not merely a moral imperative, but essential for the nation's collective future. Climate change continues to pose an existential threat, demanding ambitious and sustained action to transition to a low-carbon economy and adapt to a changing environment. Balancing economic growth with environmental protection, ensuring water security, and protecting the nation's unique biodiversity are complex tasks that require ongoing innovation and political will. Social inequality, particularly housing affordability and wealth disparity, remains a concern, challenging the ideal of a fair and egalitarian society. Furthermore, maintaining social cohesion in an increasingly diverse population, navigating geopolitical tensions, and adapting to the rapid pace of technological change are constant considerations for policymakers and citizens alike. Yet, despite these complexities, the Australian spirit of resilience, innovation, and fair go endures. Its unique blend of ancient Indigenous heritage, a strong British institutional legacy, and a vibrant multicultural tapestry defines its character. From the timeless landscapes of the dreaming to the dynamic energy of its modern cities, Australia's story is one of continuous evolution, a journey of discovery and rediscovery, adaptation and transformation. From the primordial supercontinent of Gondwana, through the astonishing endurance of its first people spanning 65 millennia, to the tumultuous arrival of European ships, Australia's history is an epic of grand scale. It's a saga of isolation shattered, of penal hardship yielding to democratic aspiration, of gold transforming a collection of colonies into a unified nation, forged in the crucible of world wars. It's the story of a continent that has weathered the global storms of depression and conflict, of a people who have tirelessly built, innovated, and adapted. We have journeyed from the ancient whispers of the dreaming, across the harsh frontier, through the bustling gold fields, and into the modern, multicultural metropolis. We've witnessed a nation grappling with its past, celebrating its diversity, and striving for a more just and equitable future. The legacy of its first peoples, once marginalized, is now increasingly recognized as the profound heart of this continent's identity. The waves of immigration have created a vibrant mosaic of cultures, making Australia a truly global nation. The story of Australia is not static. It is a living, breathing narrative, constantly being shaped by its people, its environment, and its place in an ever-changing world. It is a story of challenges overcome, of profound beauty cherished, and of a unique spirit that continues to define its path. As the sun sets on one chapter and rises on the next, Australia stands as a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of connection to country. This ancient land, now a modern nation, continues its extraordinary journey, inviting us all to witness its unfolding future.